Good evening, students. Once again, good evening to all those who have joined in this online session on measurement scales. In continuation of our discussion regarding business research methods, in today's session, we'll be talking about the measurement scales. Till now, extensively, we have discussed various stages in the research process, starting from the identification of the problem till the collection of data. So we have seen various stages in the research process, and we have extensively understood with various illustrations and examples how to carry out an authentic and effective research. So let me give a quick recap of what we have discussed till now. So we had seen that it's very important for the researcher to identify the research problem and define the research problem, and then have a better understanding about the research problem with the help of an in-depth literature review. And we had seen different types of or different sources of literature review. And then we moved to the hypothesis formulation, where we saw about alternate hypothesis, we saw about null hypothesis, we saw something about operational hypothesis, workable hypothesis, and why a researcher has to frame the hypothesis, and in what conditions he can frame the hypothesis, what are the requisites. So we had seen different aspects of hypothesis. And very important, we had seen variables that are included in the hypothesis statement should be measurable. And that is one of the important insight that we had when we discussed about hypothesis. And then we moved to the collection of data. We had seen primary and secondary sources of data. And extensively, we had seen some techniques of primary sources of data, like we have observation method, we have interview method, and then we have questionnaire method, we have schedule method. So we had seen few important techniques of how to collect the primary data. And then we move to the secondary data, where a researcher can locate data from the published source or sometimes unpublished source. So that was about the collection of data. And we also have seen that it's very important for the researcher to collect the data that is measurable, because afterwards he has to subject the data to statistical analysis. So it's very important to understand the measurement concept. Okay. So let us move to this session on measurement scales, a very important session. I want you to pay close attention to all the concepts that we discussed today in today's session, because that will help us to have a better understanding of the next stage, that is the statistical analysis. So let me present the slides to you, and let's go one by one. Let us try to understand what is measurement in research. So in the process of research, especially when we were discussing on the collection of data, we had seen that how important it is to have the data which is measurable, because it has to be statistically analyzed. And let me take you through the different concepts of measurements and scaling. So this entire research process, if you can remember, uh, in the beginning, the earlier sessions, we had seen the entire research process in brief. Now we are in the collection of data, and we are especially discussing on measuring of data. So we had seen how a researcher can collect the data and what are the sources that researcher can locate to collect the data, with primary or secondary data. Now the researcher has to measure the data because he has to statistically analyze the data. Now let us try to understand the concept of measurement in research. Okay. So what does measurement means in research? We have understood that how important is measurement in the process of research, because unless data is measurable, you cannot subject it to statistical analysis. So let us try to understand part by what is this measurement means in research. So we see that a simple definition, a simple meaning that helps us to understand measurement in research. It's actually a process of describing some property of a phenomenon of interest of the researcher, usually by assigning numbers in a reliable and valid way. This is in a simple way we can understand the measurement. So we're trying to describe the property of a phenomena. We might be actually doing a research on a person. So here the person becomes a phenomenon, or we may be observing a situation or an incident that becomes a phenomenon. Or sometimes a researcher may be doing research on animals that becomes a phenomena. So there are different aspects of this phenomena. So subject of research may be a living thing, it can be non-living thing, it can be an animal, it can be a person, it can be a situation, it can be an incident. So it can be anything that the researcher has taken for the research. So the researcher is trying to describe the property of that phenomenon, which is the major interest in his research. That's one of the important aspect of measurement in research. And we see the second part of this concept where he's assigning the numbers. That's very important because without assigning these numbers, we cannot subject it to statistical analysis. So that's one of the important part of measurement. Not only I describe the property of a phenomena of the interest that researcher has chosen for his research, but also he's assigning the numbers in a reliable and valid way, which helps to measure the data accurately. That's the objective of measurement. So hope you understood the importance of measurement in research. So whatever is the subject that the researcher has taken as for his research, he's trying to describe that phenomenon, that subject, the properties of that phenomenon or the subject, trying to assign numbers to it so that he can statistically analyze the data. So whatever the variables that the researcher is selecting, for example, a researcher may be selecting customer behavior, how customer behaves when he purchases a new product. So he describes the behavior of the customer, and he captures the behavior of the customer and assigns numbers to that behavior of that attitude of the customer and tries to measure that so that he can analyze it. So that's the concept of measurement. So whatever may be the subject that the researcher has taken for his research, he has to describe it, assign numbers to it so that he can measure it. So that's the concept of measurement in research. So let's go forward and try to understand why we assign numbers. Why we assign numbers. That's very important aspect. We saw in the definition why he is describing the phenomenon, the researcher is assigning the numbers. So what is the use of assigning the numbers? What is its utility in research? So here we see that numbers convey information about the property being measured, whether it could be attitude of a person, or I'm trying to measure his perception, or I'm trying to measure the marks of a student. So it could be anything that the researcher has taken for his research. So when he is assigning the numbers to the phenomenon, it conveys some information. And that becomes very objective. It's very important. So we can avoid subjectivity, and it becomes very objective in the research. And not only that, when numbers are used, the researcher must have a rule for assigning a number to an observation in a way that provides an accurate description. So we here also understand that assigning numbers helps the researcher to accurately describe the phenomenon that he is observing, that he is trying to measure. So that's the use of assigning numbers. That's the purpose of assigning numbers. So here researcher is not only describing the phenomenon, but he is assigning numbers so that it gives some information, and not only some information, but it gives an accurate description of the phenomenon that he is trying to measure. So that's the purpose of assigning numbers. What we measure? Well, that's very important question to be answered by the researcher. When we call measurement of the data, when we take any variables in the research, so what we are trying to measure, what a researcher is trying to measure here. A researcher here measures the attributes of objects, whatever he has taken for his research. We do not measure the object, but we are measuring the attributes of a person. For example, when I'm taking a customer for my study, I'm not measuring the customer, but I'm measuring the attributes of the customer. That's the understanding here. So when I'm trying to take a product, for example, a quality of a product, doing a research on the new product, I'm not trying to measure the product, but I'm trying to measure the attributes of the products. So that's one of the important understanding here. So we measure the attributes of the objects. We do not measure the object. Okay, that's one of the important aspects. So let me give an example to you. For example, when a researcher is measuring the attitude of a person, we are measuring his attitude, not the person. As already I said, we are measuring his attitude, not the person. Let me give one more example. When a researcher is doing, perhaps he's doing research on the profits of the companies, how the company is performing in different years. So he is trying to measure the profits of the company. So here we should understand profits. The concept profit is the attribute of the company that the researcher is trying to measure. So he's trying to measure the profits of the company, not the company. So here, two aspects here we can understand. One is the object and one is the attribute. So it is very important for the researcher to scale down or what are the attributes that he wants to measure of an object that he has taken for his research. It could be a company, it could be a product, it could be a person that he has chosen for his research. So what are the attributes that he wants to measure is very important for the researcher to know. So unless a researcher knows what are the attributes that he wants to measure, so he cannot go forward. It's very important for him to understand what are the attributes that he wants to measure. So for example, for having a better idea on the concept of what to measure, imagine an athlete. If I'm doing a research on an athlete can be assigned a letter corresponding to his performance. For example, A, it represents excellent performance. B represents good performance. And C might represent average performance. So here I'm assigning few letters. I can assign your numbers also. So that's the process of measurement when the researcher assigns letters or numbers to measure that object. So here it's an example where a researcher is trying to assign a letter to measure the performance of an athlete. So here ABC letters have different indications. A represents excellent performance, where B represents good performance, C represents average performance. Okay. Another example, a customer can be assigned a number from 1 to 10. So here, this is a case of assigning numbers about his perhaps the satisfaction. If he is buying a new product or an existing product, the researcher is trying to measure his satisfaction. So he is assigning the number. So 10 represents highly satisfied, 6 to 10 represents average satisfaction, and below 6 represents not satisfied. So the first example is a case of assigning a letter, and the second example is a case of assigning a number, where the researcher is trying to measure the attribute, in the first case of the athlete, and in the second case, the researcher is trying to measure the attribute of the customer. So in first case, athlete is the subject and the attribute is his performance. In the second case, customer is the subject and his satisfaction is the attribute that is trying to measure. So here we can understand the difference between the subject and the attribute. So a researcher should be very clear of this aspect before he measures anything of the subject that he has taken for his research. Let us try to understand with one more example. A teacher can assign a number corresponding to a percentage performance scale. So we are trying to measure the performance of a teacher here. So teacher becomes a subject here and his performance or his or her performance becomes the attribute here. So we can assign, for example, 100%, which represents the high performance, and we can assign 70 to 99%, which represents the average performance. We have less than 70%, which may represent low performance. So imagine the researcher is trying to do research on the student satisfaction, on the teacher performance. So here this one example that we were trying to assign percentage to the subject to explain the attributes of the teacher. The teacher is the subject here, his performance is the attribute. So this is another example to understand how we can assign the numbers to the subject. And a final example. A student can be assigned one of two letters corresponding to the performance. Example, you are trying to do research on students. So how to measure that subject? So the subject is student and the attribute is performance. So P represents the passing mark and F represents the failing mark. So this is how I am assigning letters to measure the attribute of a student. So P and F letters have been assigned by the researcher. So these are the few examples to understand how a researcher assigns numbers, how he assigns the letters to the subjects and try to measure the attributes of the subject. So I think you have understood how a researcher assigns numbers and letters to the subject that he has selected for his research. So even in your assignments, you have selected few concepts, you have selected few topics and titles, you have defined the problem. It's very good. I appreciate that. But here you try to understand what is the subject and what are the attributes that you're going to measure. So you already have submitted your literature review. I could see a few of the examples there, and I appreciate the way you have done. But you have to be very clear what is the subject that you're going to take into consideration in your research and what are the attributes of the subject that you're going to measure. So you should be very clear of these two concepts. Okay. For example, some of you have taken a woman entrepreneurship in India, and you have taken a few attributes also in the literature review, what that you are considering there. So woman entrepreneur becomes a subject here, and what you are trying to measure of this subject called woman entrepreneurship. So you should be very clear, and then you can thus further proceed in your research. So please make yourself very clear of these two concepts that you have already selected. So try to identify what is the subject and try to identify what is the attribute that you're going to measure of that subject. Let's go forward and try to understand a few more concepts on the measurement. So researchers should always understand here that he should be very clear with what he has to measure before knowing how to measure something. Because we have these days all the software, so the technology is there which helps a researcher to measure. So we need not worry much about how to measure something, but very important decision that a researcher has to take it what to measure. That the software or the technology will not take the decision, but as a researcher, you and I have to take decision what to measure. Okay. So there are two aspects here, what to measure and how to measure. So how to measure, it speaks about the technique which is involved in measuring the subject that we have selected for researcher. But what to measure is very important decision that a researcher has to take. Whether I want to measure the attitude of a person, whether I want to measure the perception of the object. So what is that the researcher wants to measure is very important to understand. So that objective has to be very clear from the researcher's perspective, and then he has to proceed to how to measure something. So the definition of the problem should suggest the concepts that must be measured. So when you define your problem, you have already submitted your literature review assignment where I could see that you have identified the problem and you have defined the problem. That's good. But some are not clear in this concept. So some are very clear in this concept where you have identified some concepts that you want to measure. So the definition of the problem should clearly suggest what are the variables that a researcher wants to measure. It's very important for the researcher to be sure of this aspect. So without he being sure of what are the concepts that he is going to measure, his definition of the problem becomes very vague. It's very important for the researcher to finalize or to be made sure of what is the concept that he wants to measure, what are the concepts that he wants to measure. For example, I may take a concept as age, I may take gender as a concept, or I may take education as a concept, number of children. They're all uh, also concepts. But if you see all these concepts, they are concrete properties. And they represent few problems in the definition of measurement. So it means it's very easy to measure such concepts like age, gender, education, number of children. They're all easily measured. For example, age, 60 years, or 50 years, or 10 years. It's easily measurable. Gender, so you can give a male letter M, you can give female letter F, or for male you can give number one, or for female you can give number two. So it's easy to assign the numbers, and even education also. For example, you can say uh, you can divide the slab, okay, 10th grade, and you have above 10th grade, then you have graduation, you have post graduation. So you can easily categorize here, and then you can easily assign the numbers, or letters to measure this concept, or even the number of children also. These are all called as concrete properties, which has very few problems in definition or measurement. But what is challenging for the researcher is the qualitative aspects, which becomes very difficult to measure. The first aspect is concrete properties, which we also can call as a quantitative aspects, which can be easily measured, where the researcher doesn't have any such problem in definition or measurement of such concepts. But you have some concepts like satisfaction, loyalty, personality, then you have trust, then you have culture, then you have value, attitude, and so on, which is very difficult to measure and which is very difficult to define. So here, a researcher may sometimes select concrete properties in his research. Then in that case, it is very easy for him to measure. Sometimes a researcher may be doing research on customer satisfaction, he may be doing on employee loyalty, or he may be doing research on understanding the personality traits, or he may be trying to do research on trust between the customers and the company, or he may be doing research on understanding the cultural aspects of the organization or values of the organization or employees, or he may be doing research on attitude. So all these concepts are very difficult to measure, qualitative concepts. So it's very important for the researcher to decide what he wants to measure. And then he can go for how to measure. So how to measure is not a big deal here. So the challenge here for the researcher to decide what he wants to measure. Is he measuring a concrete property, or he wants to measure the qualitative aspects? So what is that he wants to measure is one important decision that a researcher has to take. So I say that is a foundation for him to proceed. He has to decide what he wants to measure, what variables he wants to take into consideration to measure. That's very important for the researcher to understand. So let's move forward and try to understand the different levels of scale measurements. So till now we had seen what is measurement, we had seen why to measure, and we had seen importance of assigning numbers or letters in the process of measurement. And also we had seen a concept where he has to decide what to measure than how to measure. So these are a few fundamental concepts of measurement. So we move to the next level of discussion where we try to understand different levels of the scale measurements. Now, let me give with an example and then try to make you clear of all these aspects, different scales of measurements. Before we go to the different scales of measurements, whatever the scale that we select for the measurement should have at least three important characteristics. Please understand, whatever the scale that a researcher he takes for the measuring or takes for the measurement of the subject or the attributes of the subject, he has to ensure that it has these three characteristics. The one is order. Now, the order here means the scale that the researcher is selecting. It denotes the relative size, position, or importance associated with the characteristics of an object. So whether the scale denotes the relative size, the position, or the importance associated with the characteristics of an object. So the researcher has to make sure that this feature is fulfilled in the scale that is selecting to measure. For example, characteristic of an object may be value like good, better, and best. Whether the scale that the researcher has taken to measure tries to explain him this value of the subject that he has taken for measurement, like good, better, or best. For example, a researcher, if it is doing a research on the quality of the product, so whether he is able to assume value on the subject that he has taken, on the product that he has taken for his research, and try to understand how good is the product, how better is the product, how best is the product. So that's one of the important aspect of the scale characteristic, order. The second important aspect is distance. Whether the scale indicates that there are clearly known and measurable differences between the scale descriptors. That's very important feature that a scale has to fulfill. It usually, we can understand this with the example of interval scale, where the researcher is trying to understand the difference between the two, the scale descriptors. That's very important feature to be fulfilled in any scale that he selects. And final important requisite for a good scale is the origin. It implies that the scale has a unique or fixed beginning point, also called a 0 point. This helps us to understand the accuracy of the data that is trying to measure. So these are the three important features of a good scale that we need to understand. We have origin, we have distance, and we have order. Any scale of measurement that the researcher selects here, he should have these important features. And now having understood the important requisites of a good scale, let us move to different levels of measurement. So every researcher has to decide at what level he wants to measure. We had seen that what he has to measure, that he has to decide what he has to measure. But whatever is the subject he has taken to measure, he also has to decide to what level he wants to measure the subject or the attributes of the subject. For example, if the researcher has taken customer satisfaction as one of the important aspects in his research, so that is what he wants to measure. And not only that, now he has to decide to what level he wants to measure the customer satisfaction. That's very important aspect here. So not only deciding what to measure, but also deciding to what level he has to measure is also very important decision to be made by the researcher. So we have a few levels of measurement. Let us see one by one these levels of measurement. We all but already have studied these four important levels of measurement. So here we can see the first level, which is called as the nominal scale, and then you have ordinal scale, and then you have ratio scale. So now let us try to understand something about ordinal scale. Nominal scale. As the name itself says, nominal scale, it is just a named variable. We name the variable here to easily identify the variable. And then you have ordinal scale. We not only name the variables here, but also we try to order the variables. And then you have interval scale. We name the variables, we order the variables, and we also try to measure the proportionate interval between the variables. And then finally, you have ratio scale, which has got all the properties of measurement, like naming the variable, you have ordering the variables, you have proportionating the variables, we try to know the difference between the variables, and we can also accommodate absolute zero in the ratio scale. So nominal scale is the least preferred scale because it has got very less utility, whereas ratio scale is a highly preferred scale because it has all the measurement properties. Okay. So let us try to understand these four scales with an example. So let me again repeat these four important levels of measurement. So here the researcher has to decide whether he wants to measure the variable that he has selected only at the nominal level, or he wants to measure the variables that he has selected the ordinal level, or he wants to even take into consideration the interval level, or he wants to measure even the ratio level, which captures all the measurement properties here. So it depends upon the objective of the researcher also here, to what level he wants to measure. So let us try to understand with an example these different levels of measurements. So you can see in the left side here, the four scales, the nominal scale, and then you have ordinal scale, then you have interval scale, the ratio scale. This is the order of measurement. Nominal has the least utility and the ratio has the highest utility, the measurement. So in the nominal scale, let us take an example here. Imagine if a researcher is doing research on athletes. Okay, if he's doing research on athletes. Now here you can see there are three athletes. Okay? There are three athletes who have numbers assigned to them. Number 7 here, number 8, and number 3. So these numbers are assigned to these athletes to identify them. That's the only utility of the nominal scale. So here the researcher is assigning numbers to each athlete to identify them. Now, without assigning numbers to these athletes, it becomes very difficult for the referee to identify which athlete has won the race, which athlete has got second prize, third prize. So that's why he's assigning the numbers to identify the athletes. That's the role of the nominal scale. It helps the researcher to identify his objects, identify his respondents. That's the utility of the nominal scale. Other than that, this nominal scale doesn't have any other utility. For example, number 7, which is assigned to this athlete, doesn't describe anything about this athlete. Similarly, number 8 or number 3, this number has nothing to do with this athlete's character. It only helps the researcher to identify this respondent. Okay, the number 3 is such respondent. Number 8 is this and this respondent. Number 7 is this respondent or this athlete. So that's the only utility of nominal scale. And the second level of measurement is the ordinal scale. The same example we can see here in the ordinal scale. Here we are ranking the athletes. So you can see here the third place second place, first place. So ordinal scale gives the position of the subject. So in the nominal scale, this numbers doesn't indicate the position of the subjects. It only helps to identify the subjects. Whereas the ordinal scale, it helps to understand the position of each subject that has been taken for the research or for the study. So this athlete is in third place, this athlete is in second place, and this athlete is in first place. So rank order of winners is what we can understand here with the help of ordinal scale. So ordinal scale helps to understand helps to understand ordering of the variables. Here the variable is the performance of the athletes, and we are trying to order the performance of the athletes from first to third place. So that's called ordering. So in the first nominal scale, we have seen assigning numbers just to identify the subjects. In the second scale, we are not only identifying, but we are trying to even understand the position of these subjects. But what is the defect of this ordinal scale is we don't have any data on the difference between the third place and the second place, or what is the difference between second place and the first place. So that is not measured here. Here it only ranks the position of the athletes or the subjects, but is not measuring the difference. So in order to do that, we have a next scale, which is called as interval scale. So in the interval scale, we are trying to understand even the difference between the subjects here, okay, the performance of the subjects here, the performance of the athletes. So here we can easily understand here how the interval scale helps us to understand the difference here. So here you can see. So the difference between the first place winner and the second place winner is 1 second. Whereas the difference between the second prize winner and the third prize winner is 20 seconds. So this is called interval, which we don't see in the ordinal scale. So in the interval scale, we are not only identifying the subjects, we are not only understanding the position of the subjects, but also we are trying to understand what is the difference between the performance of these athletes. So all the three characteristics are fulfilled here. And the highest level of last measurement is ratio scale, which is not seen in interval scale. So here we can understand in the last stage here, what is the ratio scale. So the first place winner, if you can understand or describe the ratio here, what is the time that he has taken to win the race? So 1 minute 59 seconds for 1 mile or 1.5 miles. So whatever the distance that he has run as in the race. So we are trying to convert it to ratio and try to understand accurately, exactly what is the time that he has taken to finish the race. So the ratio scale has all the properties of measurement. So this is one example to understand all these 4 scales with the example of these athletes. Let me repeat again. In the nominal scale, the role is only to identify the subjects, whereas ordinal scale helps not only to identify the subjects, but also helps to know the position of the subjects. The third scale not only identifies, not only understands the position, but also we try to measure the difference or the interval between the subjects or the athletes that here we are trying to measure the performance. And finally, we have ratio scale, which has got all the 3 properties of measurement and gives an accurate picture of what is actually the performance of an athlete. So these are the 4 levels of scales of measurement. Now the researcher, he has to decide to what level he wants to measure. If he stops with only nominal, then there is no use for him, because that doesn't have any utility for him in the research, because just assigning numbers to identify the subjects doesn't give any interpretation, does not give any meaning to the variables. So the researcher, he has to always have an objective of accurate measurement of data, and then select a scale that helps him to measure the data accurately. That's a choice, that's a decision that the researcher has to take here. Okay. So these are four primary scales of measurement. Now let us try to understand in a more detailed way the scales, different scales that we have just now seen with an example. So let's go one by one. Nominal scale. As we have already seen, nominal scale is just a descriptive name to identify the subject that is taken for measurement. There's no value attached to it. There is no ranking attached to it. So it has got very less utility for the researcher. But still we find that researchers, they use nominal scale. For example, if researcher is doing research with 10 customers, so he may name the 10 customers 1 to 10, customer number 1, customer number 2, customer number 3, which helps him to identify the customers, even though it doesn't give any meaning, but still it is easy for him to identify the customers by assigning the numbers. Or researcher may be doing research on households, so he may name the 100 households from 1 to 100. So it is easy for him to identify the household. Okay, household number 1, household number 50. So a nominal scale helps to identify the subjects, but doesn't have any value, doesn't have any ranking. So he can even assign numbers, he can assign colors, he can assign letters also. So we can see some examples here. It has got very restricted use as it only helps to identify the subject. Further statistical analysis is not, it cannot be done. And we can see also some of the statistical techniques that we can use for the nominal data. Those statistical techniques we'll understand in a detailed way in the next stage when we study the statistical analysis. So then you have ordinal scale. The first we have seen nominal scale, and then we have ordinal scale. Intervals of scale are not equal. That's one of the important aspect here we need to understand. No absolute values, percentile or quartile is used for measuring the ordinal data. And we can use even rank order correlations also. Non-parametric test is done. So what is this parametric and non-parametric test? We'll understand in detail in the next stage, in the statistical analysis. And especially non-parametric data, we can here understand the qualitative data where we are trying to order such data. So we call the tests which are used here is called as non-parametric test. Whereas parametric test is the statistical technique which is used to measure the quantitative data. So that's the brief difference between parametric and non-parametric, which we'll understand in the next stage. Then you have the other concept here that ordinal scales are used in qualitative research. So non-parametric here indicates the qualitative data, which also is called as qualitative research. So ordinal scale is used in qualitative research. For example, if I'm doing research on understanding customer satisfaction on a product, so satisfaction is a qualitative concept. So I can ask the customer to rank his satisfaction from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So that's one of the example that we use to measure the customer satisfaction. Ranked highest to the lowest. For example, how long do you spend in reading newspaper in a week? So we're trying to rank here the perception or the attitude of a subject here. So that's ordinal data which ranks the position of the subject. Then we have interval scale, the third scale, which you have seen with example already earlier. Now here, interval scale is again very powerful compared to ordinal scale because of the continuous interval that can be measured. And we can use mean, measure of tendency here, and standard deviation is used for dispersion to measure dispersion of in the data. And we can use even t-test and even f-test for significance. This all we will study in the statistical chapter, statistical analysis, the next stage. But here we should understand in the interval scale, there is no absolute zero. For example, if the researcher is doing a research on temperature, so zero does not mean that there is no temperature. So here, zero is not absolute zero. It's relative. You should understand. Even test scores. So if a student is scoring zero, that doesn't mean that a student is not intelligent or student does not have any knowledge on the subject. So zero doesn't have absolute value here. It's relative zero here in the interval scale. That's why this also is not an accurate scale of measurement. And the final scale is the ratio scale, which is a very accurate scale of measurement, which has all the properties of the measurement. So here we can see the difference. So you can go through the difference, but we'll see only the ratio part here. So 0 point is fixed. Ratio of scale values can be compared. So that's one of the important feature of a ratio scale. So 0 is absolute 0 here. That's why we can do accurate measurements in with the help of ratio scale. Like some of the marketing examples are age, sales, income, cost. Some of the statistical techniques that we can use: geometric mean, harmonic mean, coefficient of variation. So these are some examples which we will in detail understand in the statistical analysis stage. Yes, dear students, I think now you're very clear with these four important scales of measurement. So before we proceed to the statistical analysis, it's very important for you to understand these four important scales of measurement. Okay. So let us have a quick recap of these four scales before we proceed. Okay. So we saw a nominal scale, ordinal, interval, and ratio scale. Before that, we saw that it's very important for the researcher to decide what he wants to measure. This first question he has to answer. Then to what level he wants to measure the subject that he has taken for his research is very important. So he can, these are the four levels of measurement that we have seen. And with the examples we had seen, please come back to me if you have any doubts on these measurement scales. I will try to discuss during the online classes. So let us move forward and try to understand some of the scaling techniques, to have an in-depth understanding of the scaling concept. Okay. So we can divide the scaling techniques into two: this comparative scales and one is non-comparative scales. So let's see what is non-comparative and comparative in the coming slides. And further, we have comparative scales, paired comparison, rank order, and constant sum. So let us see with the examples what these mean. And then we have non-comparative continuous rating scales, we have itemized rating scales, which has again three types. We have Likert scale, we have semantic differential scale, and we have staple scales. So broadly, scaling techniques are divided into these two: comparative scales and non-comparative scales. So let us try to understand first the difference between what is comparative scale and what is non-comparative scale. So what does this comparative scale mean? When a researcher selects a comparative scale of measurement to measure the data, what does it mean? So this scale, it involves the direct comparison of stimulus objects. Comparative scale data must be interpreted in relative terms and have only ordinal or rank order properties. Let's understand with examples in the coming slides. So here we'll understand, here one of the important feature of this scale is direct comparison of the stimulus subject. So whatever the subjects that the researcher has taken for his research, there is a direct comparison of those subjects and is trying to interpret. Then you have non-comparative scale, where each object which is scaled independently of others in the stimulus set. So independent scaling is done in the non-comparative scales. So the data which is resulted through the non-comparative scale is usually interval or ratio scale. So that's about comparative scale and non-comparative scale. And when we try to understand with the types of comparative and non-comparative, then I hope you will have a better understanding. So let's go to comparative scale techniques. Okay. The first aspect is paired comparison scaling. So what happens in paired comparison, as paired itself means there are two objects. So a respondent is selected and is given with two objects that the researcher has selected for his research and asked to select one according to some criterion. So imagine the customer is asked to select one best car among two cars. So, based on some criterion that the researcher has selected, like could be quality or speed or mileage. So whatever could be the criterion that researcher selected, the respondent has to select one out of these two cars, okay, based on the criterions that the researcher has given. So that's an example here. The data obtained are ordinal in nature because here the respondent is trying to rank which object is better than the other object. So that's why we call it as ordinal in nature. Paired comparison scaling is the most widely used comparative scaling technique, especially in marketing. We use this comparison scaling technique to understand what is the perception of the respondent or the customer towards the products, different products. So with n brands, so if we are taking n number of brands, and this is how we try to measure with the help of paired comparison. Two products we take, two brands we take, and the customer has to choose one out of the two brands. Under assumption of transitivity, it is possible to convert paired comparison data into a rank order. So here we can understand, okay, which product the customer prefers compared to the other product. So we can even rank all the brands, rank the objects that the customer or the researcher has selected for his research. So we can even convert the paired comparison into a rank order because we can easily understand which is preferred most by the respondent here. Thus, we can rank the products also. So that's a paired comparison method. So let's understand with an example here. So here we can understand with an example. So here we have different shampoos. So here the shampoos we can see in the vertical also and horizontal. So this is how we try to compare in pairs. So here the researcher is presenting the 10 pairs of shampoo brands. And for each pair, the customer or the respondent has to indicate which one of the two brands of shampoo he prefers for his use. So this is one example to understand the paired comparison. So we can take 10 cars here also, 10 brands in automobiles. We can take 10 education institutions if I'm doing research on education institutions. And we can understand which institution or which car that the respondent prefers more than the other car or other institution. So that's the example of paired comparison, which can be adopted by the researcher in measuring his data through this technique. Then you have rank order scaling. This already we have understood in the previous slides. Here, where the respondents are presented with several objects, just like in the paired comparison. Here also, respondents are present with several objects simultaneously, and they are asked to order or rank them according to some criteria. As simple as that. For example, let me show an example here. So here, the respondents are presented with the toothpaste that they have to rank. So which toothpaste they prefer compared to other toothpastes. So here, this is one example of rank order, which is again popularly used in research to understand the preference of the customer preference in choosing the product or service that they buy. So that's rank order scaling. So in rank order scaling, we are trying to order the products or the brands, anything that the researcher has selected for his research. We are trying to understand what is the preference of the customer or respondents or regarding those products or objects he has selected. So here, rank order scaling, it also results in ordinal data because we are ordering the data here. And this is again a popular method which is used in marketing to understand the customer preference of the product or service. So that's about rank order scaling. That's an example. Then you have the third technique in the comparative scale. We have constant sum scaling. There's one more technique which can be used in measuring the data. So what does this constant sum scaling mean? Now, as the name itself says here, respondents, they are given here a chance to allocate a constant sum of units. For example, it can be 100, it can be 1,000 also. So the number is just an example. So it can be any number where the customers can allocate constant sum, and they can measure the attitude of the respondents towards a product or service. So here, 100 points to attribute of a product to reflect their importance. If an attribute is unimportant, the respondent assigns it 0 points. Okay. And if an attribute is twice as important as some other attribute, it receives twice as many points. That's one of the example to measure the data. The sum of all the points is 100 here. Hence, the name of the scale is also called as constant sum method. Now, this is one example, a classic example where we can understand the constant sum method. So here we can see different aspects of a perfume, for example, mildness, lather, shrinkage, price, fragrance, packaging, moisturizing, uh, cleaning powder. So these are the different attributes that are being measured of a product. And here we see different segments of customers which are selected to measure the attributes of this product. So here in segment 1, we can see price is given the highest points, means they are price sensitive. And the lowest point is given to leather. So that is occupying the least preference in attributing the object. And then you have in second segment, the highest point is given to the 60. So cleaning power. So what is the cleaning power of the detergent that has been taken for research here? The lowest is 0. So fragrance. So here, the second segment, customers are not worried about fragrance, but they are more worried about cleaning power of the detergent. Whereas in first segment, here the customers are more worried about the price. So they are the price sensitive segment. Then you have third segment. The highest number is given to here moisturizing. So the customers are more preferring moisturizing here. The least is given to mildness. So this is example of a constant sum scale. So we can understand the different attributes of the product or a service with this constant sum scale technique, which is also popularly used the research, marketing research. So these are three comparative scales that we have seen. Okay, please understand. Let's go back and try to understand these three comparative scales. You have paired comparison, you have rank order, and then you have constant sum. So in paired comparison, the respondent is presented with a pair of products where he has to choose the best of the pair. And then in the rank order, the customers are presented with the products and they have to choose which product they prefer over the other product. We're trying to order the preference here. And in constant sum scale, he is assigning the points and trying to uh, assign the points to the attributes of the product or service. And thus we try to understand which attribute uh, has preferred, has been preferred more by the customer or the respondents for any object that has been taken by the researcher to measure. So this is comparative scales. Now let us move to the non-comparative scales. We had seen already what is comparative and non-comparative scale. So let us try to understand about the non-comparative scales. In most of the non-comparative scale, if you look at the technique itself, we try to measure uh, the qualitative aspects. The non-comparative techniques are usually used to measure the qualitative variables that we'll try to understand now with the examples. The non-comparative has two. One is continuous rating scale. You can see here an itemized rating scale. So now we are looking in the non-comparative scale. So till now we had seen comparative. Now we are looking into the non-comparative scales where we can use continuous rating scales and we can use itemized rating scale also. So what is this continuous rating scale? Now here with the example, we can understand this continuous rating scale. It's very simple and it's very commonly used technique in measuring the data. Under it, the various points are usually put along the line to form a continuum. That's why it is called as a continuous rating scale. And here the respondents indicate his or her rating by simply making a mark, the appropriate point, on a line that runs from one extreme to another. So here, an example to understand the continuous rating scale, which you might have already seen in some questionnaires. So imagine I am doing a research on the customer perception of the product. So the question is, how do you like the product? So this is a scale. So first you present the like very much, and then you have like somewhat, then you have neutral, you have dislike somewhat, and then you have dislike very much. So you have 5-point scale here on a continuum. So liking is what which is measured here, whether the customer likes this product or not. So customer or respondent has to simply mark what he wants to mark, and then we can summarize the all items that we have selected here that we want to measure about the product, and then we'll come to know what is the customer perception regarding the product or service. So that's continuous rating scale. So we can see continuum here of measurement. Then you have itemized rating scale. Now here scale which has the numbers or brief descriptions of each category which is given to the respondents. This also we'll understand with examples. It will be very clear now. Categories are ordered in terms of scale positions. We're trying to order the categories, whereas in continuous scale we have seen there is a continuum, but here we can see an ordering of scale positions. The respondents select one of the categories that best describes the stimulus object, whatever the researcher has selected to measure. Though some of the commonly used itemized rating scales, we have Likert scale, we have semantic differential scale, and we have staple scale. So let us try to understand these three itemized rating scales. The first is Likert scale. Likert scale, or we also call it summated scales, they are developed by utilizing the item analysis approach, wherein a particular item is evaluated on the basis of how well it discriminates between those persons whose total score is high and those whose score is low. This looks very difficult to understand, but when we look at the examples, definitely you'll be very clear with what is Likert scale. You must have already used the Likert scale without having understanding of this concept. Let us know with the examples what is this Likert scale. So you have 5 points here. We can even have 7 points also. So here I'm trying to understand about, perhaps by looking at the question, we can understand about the website quality of a company. So for example, the first question is, the online auction site contains abundance of exhibits. So a customer may strongly disagree, sometimes he may disagree, he may neither agree, neutral. Sometimes he agrees, sometimes he strongly agrees. So we are trying to measure the attitude of the customer here, the perception of the customer, what he feels about the online auction site with regards to the abundance of exhibits. Then user registration is complex at this site. So here we are trying to measure how user-friendly is the website. So some may disagree, some may agree. So we are trying to capture the customer attitude towards the user-friendly feature of the website. Then you have auction site commission is reasonable. So we have different questions. These are different items that the researcher wants to measure, and these are different levels of measurement: strongly agree, disagree, and neutral, agree, strongly agree. So this is called Likert scale items. This is a very popular method which is used in collecting the data, especially the qualitative data, measuring the customer attitude or customer satisfaction, customer preference. This is one popular scale which is used. Then you have semantic differential scale. Now here, the attempt is to measure the psychological meanings of an object to an individual. As I already said, most of these non-comparative scales are used to measure the qualitative data. So here we are trying to understand how to measure the psychological aspect of the respondent regarding an object. And this scale is based on the presumption that an object can have different dimensions, which is captured through this scale of connotative meanings, which can be located in multidimensional properties space. or what can be called a semantic space. That's why it is called a semantic differential scale. Now, let's understand with an example. So you have, in this example, two extremes we can find here. In Likert scale, we had seen different degrees of measurement where we can capture the attitude of the customer. But here we have two extremes. The space is given here. Between the extremes, abundance of exhibits. The same example here, I'm explaining the semantic differential scale item. So on the left extreme, you have abundance of exhibits, and you have right extreme, you have scarcity of exhibits. So the respondents are asked to mark in this space. If the mark is here, where you can see my red point here. So if this is a mark, it shows that there is abundance of exhibits. But here, if it is marked right extreme, it shows the scarcity of exhibits exhibited in the website. If somewhere, if it is in the middle, it shows that it is neutral. It is neither abundant, it is neither scarce. So that's the interpretation. Then you have complex user registration. So if the respondent marks here to the left extreme, it indicates that the website is very complex, it is not user-friendly. But if he is marking in the right extreme, that shows that customer prefers this website because it is user-friendly, simple user registration. So in this way, I can capture the customer attitude on different aspects through this scale. This is called semantic differential scale, where two extremes are presented to the respondents. Then you have staple scale. This is a unipolar rating scale with usually 10 categories numbered from -5 to +5. So here we see assigning numbers to measure the data. And this scale does not have 0 or the neutral point, whereas in other previous scales, we can see the neutral point. In the previous scales, whether it's a semantic scale or it's a Likert scale, we can see the neutral point, but here in staple scale, we don't usually see the neutral point or doesn't have any 0. Respondents rate how each term describes the object by selecting the appropriate number. Positive number means the term describes the object accurately, whereas negative number, if the respondent selects, it means he is describing it inaccurately, or the object is inaccurately described. In other way, +5, if the respondent is selecting, it means the highest degree of accuracy. If the customer is selecting -5, that shows he is the highest degree of inaccuracy. So that's the interpretation here. So if the researcher is using staple scale, it will look this way. Let me give an example here for you to understand how this staple scale looks. For example, if a researcher is trying to measure the respondent about a restaurant, what is his perception about a restaurant? If the restaurant owner has asked you as a researcher to understand customer perception of the restaurant. So here is an example to understand. Okay, so you have 3 dimensions that are taken here. One is tasty food, second is fast service, and good ambience. So these are the 3 aspects that the researcher wants to measure. And researcher has been given the responsibility to, or the task to measure these 3 aspects, these 3 dimensions. So if, for example, if the customer marks +5, so you can note here, if the customer marks or respondent marks +5, it means the food is very tasty. And if it goes to negative, it means food is not tasty. So there is no neutral 0 here. Okay. And similarly, fast service. So if 1 he marks, it means it is not so fast service. If he goes for 5, the service is very fast, very quick. And again, if he marks negative numbers, it means that service is not so fast. Similarly, the ambience. If the customer is marking somewhere 4 or 5, it means the ambience is good. And if again it goes to negative, that is not a good sign. It means the ambience is not so good. So this is one way of measuring the different dimensions, different aspects of the subject. So here the subject is food or the restaurant. And I'm trying to measure these attributes of the restaurant, that is tasty food, fast service, and good ambience. And here the customer or respondent is asked to select out of this positive and negative numbers which are assigned to measure the customer attitude on tasty food or fast service or good ambience. On a whole, his attitude on the quality of the restaurant. So this is the example of the staple scale. So these are all non-comparative scales which are used to measure the qualitative aspects like customer attitudes, customer perception, customer satisfaction. So all these are different aspects of non-comparative scales. So we have seen now the comparative scales and non-comparative scales, which can be used by the researcher to capture the data and to measure the data. Okay. Now, if you look at some of the aspects of these scales, it's very important that whatever the scale that the researcher is selecting should actually help the researcher to achieve the objective of the research. Whether the researcher was able to measure what he wanted to measure. That's very important question that a researcher has to ask. Whatever the scale that he selects, whether he is able to measure what he wants to measure. Here we'll understand some of the strengths of this item scales that we have seen till now. Okay. Whether the scale is valid, it's a very important question to be asked. Now, validity can be understood with respect of content validity, with respect to construct validity, with respect to predictive validity. So finally, here researcher asks himself whether the scale that he has selected to measure is valid scale or not with respect to content, with respect to construct, and with respect to predictive validity. Not only valid, but it should be reliable. The scale which is selected for measurement, whether it's reliable scale or not. So these are the two aspects that has to be seen. There are many other aspects, but I have taken only these two aspects, whether the scale is valid with respect to content, construct, and predictive, or whether the scale is reliable or not. So if these two qualities or if these requisites are fulfilled, then researcher can go forward with that scale and can capture the data or measure the data. So let us try to understand what is validity. Now, the validity of a scale is the extent to which it is a true reflection of the underlying variable it is attempting to measure. So in other words, whether the scale is able to capture the data, what the researcher wants to capture, or in other words, whether the scale is able to measure what the researcher wanted to measure. So that's very important. So whether it may be a Likert scale or whether it is a staple scale or it's a comparative scales, whatever the scale that the researcher is selecting, whether it is able to measure what the researcher wanted to measure accurately. That's one of the underlying point that researcher has to consider before he selects any scale. Okay. So validity can be content validity, face validity or content validity also we can call. The extent to which the content of a measurement scale seems to tap all relevant facets of an issue that can influence respondents' attitude. In other words, whenever a researcher is selecting a scale, it should be valid. When it comes to content validity, what it means here, whether the scale is able to capture all the aspects of the subject that he wants to measure. We saw just now the researcher wants to measure the customer satisfaction and restaurant quality. So by using that staple scale, whether the researcher is able to capture all the aspects of the customer attitude towards the restaurant quality, is that what needs to be answered here? If yes, then we can say, yes, the scale is having the content validity. So that's an example here. Construct validity. Now here it means the nature of the underlying variable or construct measured by the scale. So that's the construct validity, the nature of the underlying variable. What is the nature of the variable that the researcher is trying to measure here? Okay. Predictive validity. This refers to how well the attitude measured provided by the scale predicts some other variable or characteristic. Whether the researcher is able to predict the other variables based upon the present variables that he is measuring. Okay, that's very important. So in this case of restaurant quality, we have seen by using that scale is trying to measure the restaurant quality, the customer perception, the restaurant quality. So by measuring that, will he be able to predict whether other customers will prefer this restaurant or not, or whether the same customer will come again to this restaurant or not? Is he able to predict with that data? That's very important question to be answered. So predictive validity. And the second important requisite of any good scale is reliability. Now, what is reliability? It shows the consistency of the scale or the stability of the scale to measure the data. So reliability measures how consistent or stable the ratings generated by the scale are likely to be. So, for example, when a researcher is trying to measure the attitude of the customers, okay, and today he has given this scale to the customer to mark the scale or to respond to this questionnaire, and after a few months, if the scale is given again to the same customers, is the scale able to capture the same attitude of the customers? That's very important here to understand the reliability aspect, the consistency of the scale to measure the data. Even if the respondent size is increased, whether the scale is able to measure consistently what the researcher want to measure is what has to be answered by the researcher here. So one is validity, and then you have reliability. A good scale is always should be a valid scale, and it should be a reliable scale. Okay. So here we come to the end of the measurement scales. Okay. So let's go back and try to have a quick recap what we have studied till now. Okay. Let me take to you the main scale, main slide here. So we had seen what is measurement and how important is measurement of data in research, because without measuring the data, you cannot do the statistical analysis. So accuracy is not possible without you measure the data. And then very importantly, we have seen that instead of understanding how to measure the data, very important, the researcher has to decide what to measure. Okay. So whatever the object or subject the researcher is taking for his research, so researcher has to decide what to measure. And not only what to measure, the researcher also has to decide to what level he wants to measure the object that he has taken for his research. So we had seen 4 levels of measurement, namely the nominal scale, then we had seen the ordinal scale, then we had seen interval scale, and then we had seen the ratio scale. Okay. Ratio scale has all the properties of measurement, which gives the accurate measurement of the data. And then we had seen some of the scaling techniques that can be used by the researcher to measure the data. So we had seen comparative scales and we had seen non-comparative scales. So paired comparison, where the customer is presented with pair of products or objects where he has to choose one out of the 2 products which is given to him, or 2 objects which is given to him, which also can be converted into order scale. Then you have rank order, which is used to order the data, order the objects, the attributes that the customer prefers here. And then we have constant sum scale, where again the attributes of the objects can be measured through this scale. Then you have non-comparative scales, continuous rating scale and itemized rating scales. Very important is itemized rating scale. We have seen Likert scale, semantic, and staple scale. Okay. So please go through these slides again, because one session we will not be able to understand all these technical aspects. So I request you to kindly go through these concepts again. And if you have any doubts, clarifications, please come again to me. We will have discussion in the online classes on this session again. Okay. So let me wind up this session again now. And before I wind up this session, let me just say what we're going to discuss in the coming sessions. So in the next session, we'll be discussing about case study method and survey method, which we did not discuss in the earlier session. So in the next session, we'll be talking about case study and the survey method. And after that, we'll move towards statistical analysis, a very important part. We'll go to the statistical analysis stage. So if you look at this research process, we have seen the first defining research problem, then we saw literature review, then we saw about formulating hypothesis, and then designing research design, and then collection of data. In collection of data, now we had seen about measurement of data and some scaling techniques. The next session, as I already said, we'll be talking about case study and survey method, and then we move to the analysis part. Okay, so that's the sequence of discussions. So kindly subscribe to this channel for the more updates, and keep watching the sessions to have the continuity of understanding. Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you for your patient listening. I trust that you are keeping safe and you're healthy. Stay home, stay healthy, and keep in touch for more updates. Thank you.